Thank you. Thank you very much. What I'd like to do this morning is to talk about the social, the built, and the natural environment in Gaza. And I'll do that by first walking you through in very outlined fashion the history of Gaza, very briefly, I promise. And then I'll proceed to talk about Gaza in two major parts. The first being what happened in Gaza from the period of roughly 2007 until 2022-23, before the October 7th, 2023 invasion, raid by the militants from Gaza. And then I'll talk about the subsequent events that happened after October 7th that we've been dealing with ever since. And I think that's appropriate because you can't really understand what's been happening in the last year or so without understanding what happened in the previous 16. That really set the stage. In some ways, what's happened since is many orders of magnitude different, such that in this case, quantity becomes a kind of different quality. But nonetheless, without talking about that previous context, I think we can't really appreciate what has happened and what continues to happen in Gaza. I have a poem that I won't read, but from a Gazan poet who writes exclusively in English, Mustafa Butoa, which I think is appropriate for the talk. And it provides a background or context that I'm not going to talk about this afternoon, namely the actual conflict, the actual fighting that's been going on. That is assumed that you understand what's been going on, but I'm not going to go through any detail. That poem sort of speaks everything I need to say about that, I think. So to get some understanding of Gaza in terms of demographic features, it's a country, or I shouldn't say a country, it is an enclave that has about 2.3 million people today, and it's one of the densest populations in the world. Over 500 inhabitants per 100 square meters. It is almost exclusively made up of Palestinian Arabs. And what is important to note is that 2/3 of them are refugees, either direct refugees or people who are descendants of refugees. It's also true that the vast majority are Sunni Muslims, but there's also and long been a very small Christian community divided between Catholics and Orthodox communities. And it's also important to note that half the population is children, that is people under 16 or under. So it's a very, very young and youthful population. In terms of physical geography, Gaza is a very small territory, only about 141 square miles. It's roughly just a tinge smaller than the city of Detroit. Almost exactly the same parameters. It's some 25 miles long at its longest, between 5 and 8 miles wide. So it's very, very tiny, in which are packed 2.3 million people. Gaza today is 87% urbanized, but note that, as I'll share with you, there is a lot of agriculture going on, or used to go on, within this highly urbanized landscape. It is divided into 5 administrative units or governorates, which I'll talk about later more. North Gaza, Gaza, Deir al-Balah, Khan Yunis, and Rafah. It borders the Mediterranean, Egypt, and Israel. And it's on the terminus of the Levantine coastline, meaning that Gaza is the sort of endpoint for temperate climate in the Mediterranean. You can start out from Syria, go down to Lebanon, then into Gaza, and then it swings out into the African continent, where we have, more arid places like Egypt and Tunisia and Algeria and Libya and so on. So in some ways, it's been blessed with a favorable climate, which has benefited it for centuries. It's fed by a coastal aquifer, which I'll talk more about, which has long supported very diverse agriculture, including a very vibrant, until recently, citriculture. Wadi Gaza, or the Gaza Valley, is a wetland sourced from Israel. that runs through the width of Gaza. And as Gaza, like all of Palestine and Israel, sits at the crossroads of Eurasia and Africa, it's long been a very important flyover for migratory birds. And many species live or try to live in Gaza, including the Palestine sunbird. However, due to chaotic urbanization and the effects of prolonged occupation, the wadi has been seriously degraded. Protection and restoration efforts have been interrupted by ongoing conflicts. But in 2000, the Gazans tried to seize the bull by the horn, so to speak, and designated the wadi a nature reserve. But still, the efforts to restore it are lagging due to lack of resources and an appropriate political climate. Gaza in antiquity is one of the oldest, I should say Gaza City, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on the planet with a history of at least 3 millennia. It's located on the Via Maris, which is an ancient trade route that went from Gaza, Palestine, into Syria, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia. It long had strategic value and was contested by many empires. Gaza was part of the five city kingdom or Pentapolis of the Philistines, a maritime group of settlers from the Aegean who mixed with the local Canaanite population and gave their name to the Roman province of Palestine and today as Palestinians. That is a very simplistic overview of a very complicated history, but there you go. The Philistines later will clash with the Jewish population of the interior because they hindered the latter's access to the sea. And this occasioned two of the more well-known biblical stories of Samson and David and Goliath. And the illustration here is of David carrying away the gates of the city of Gaza. I'm sorry, Samson carrying away the gates of the city of Gaza. Very briefly, Gaza also has an important connection to Islam. Gaza was a passageway, a thoroughfare for a caravan pilgrimage tradition that went from Syria and Palestine into the Arabian Peninsula to Mecca, where people worshipped at the Kaaba before the prophet would cleanse it of its pagan rituals and polytheism. And one of the caravan leaders at the time who died in Gaza would become known as the great-great-grandfather of the prophet. Another caravan leader at the time became the second caliph or second follower of the prophet and led military campaigns against the Byzantine and Persian empires. Again, very simplified history, but there you go, showing Gaza's significance there. In the contemporary period, as I talked about in October, Gaza as part of Palestine was partitioned by the United Nations. We won't go through that process and the heartache that has caused. But at the time, Gaza was a very substantial part of Palestine. As you can see from the map, Gaza in its northern reaches paralleled the cities of Bethlehem and Jerusalem. But after the war that was triggered by partition, where Israel, what became the state of Israel, acquired an additional 22% of Palestine above what they were granted in the partition, Gaza lost its northern reaches and now only parallels further south to the city of Hebron. And in the process, it lost a lot of agricultural land, in particular, a lot of citrus land, which I'll again talk about later in the talk. More significant is that, or at least as significant, the Nakba, the catastrophe that occasioned the formation of the state of Israel for the Palestinians, their expulsion in mass and loss of control, funneled over 200,000 refugees into Gaza. Its population soared from some 80,000 to over 200,000 by the end of the 1940s, which is why Gaza almost overnight became highly urbanized and in a very unplanned fashion, which it suffered from ever since. Gaza has also played a very significant role in the Palestinian resistance movement. After the formation of the state of Israel, Gaza fell under the administration of Egypt. The West Bank, the other major Palestinian territory, fell under the control of Jordan. The two were disunited, if you will, under the control of two separate states. Gazans tried to return to their homes many times, even to continue farming their fields that had been lost to them, and they were regarded as infiltrators and treated very harshly through arrest, detention, and as many as 5,000 between 1949 and 1967 were killed in the process. 8 refugee camps sprouted out in Gaza, which still exist today, though they're no longer really camps, they're more like cities, which were where the tent formations had become their nucleus, and now they're just major concentrations of population. But these also became breeding grounds for what Palestinians call the fedayeen, the people who sacrificed for the national cause. Yasser Arafat, who would co-found the leading Palestinian faction of what became the Palestinian Liberation Organization, his father was born in Gaza, and the organization was founded in Gaza. And while Gaza at this time, as I noted, was under Egyptian control, the Egyptian leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, a leader of the non-aligned movement, regarded Gaza and the Palestinian cause in general as a major element in the struggle for the liberation of people in the global South. And Gaza became part of that struggle and a sort of important pilgrimage for many of the non-aligned leaders. Che Guevara visits in 1959, the Indian leader Nehru visits in 1960, and Malcolm X was not exactly associated with that movement, but very important nonetheless, visited in 1964. In 1967, of course, there's a 6-day war in which Israel preemptively attacks Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, and seizes Gaza, the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, all of Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, formerly controlled by Syria. One result of this is that for the first time since 1947, the Palestinian communities of Gaza and the West Bank are united. They're put under a single administration, but it is an administration of Israeli military rule. Nonetheless, they're no longer separated as such. And unlike the blockade that I'll talk about that descends on Gaza in the 21st century, at this time, Gaza, like the rest of Palestine, is fairly open. Movement is quite free. Gazans and other Palestinians can move back and forth and visit each other. They can go to Israel without much interference. But at the same time, they do live under military occupation. They're subject to detention, searches, and interrogations. And it's at this time in Gaza that Jewish-only residential settlements are established. A kind of apartheid regime descends on the territory, and Israeli forces clamp down heavily on any expression of Palestinian nationalism, where Gaza is especially a concern because of the density of its population and the radicality of its population. After some 20 years of occupation and still stateless, those in Gaza experienced the harshest forms of Israeli control and rule. And then in December 1987, as I roll forward, a simple traffic accident involving an Israeli military vehicle killing 4 Palestinians sparks outrage and becomes the first intifada, or the first uprising, which was at this time really a mass civil disobedience campaign, which completely flummoxed the Israeli authorities. And while they tried to crush it with their famous breaking bones policy, they could not do so. It's also at this time, this very year, where the movement for Islamic resistance, or Hamas, is born. The first intifada sort of jolted many Israelis into the recognition that the occupation that had been going on since 1967 was neither as benign as they thought or as sustainable as they wished. And it forced the first face-to-face negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis, something called the Oslo peace process. It resulted in the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, a semi-autonomous government with some control over the West Bank, some control over Gaza, headquartered initially led by Yasser Arafat in Gaza. At this time, there were great expectations in Gaza and the West Bank. Gaza was hailed as a potential Singapore of the Mediterranean. The Yasser Arafat International Airport was open in this spirit, and it looked like perhaps things were beginning to change and there was reason for optimism. But at the same time, since the first Intifada, Israel began imposing a number of movement restrictions on people and goods, concerned about security. And they initiate what they call the permit system, in which people cannot leave the West Bank or Gaza without permits issued by Israeli authorities. This would also come to dominate trade as well. And this is why, if you're a Gazan, you must register your birth, your death, your marriage, your divorce with Israeli authorities so that you're on the population register controlled by Israel, or your possibility for obtaining one of these valid permits, which are not easily given or received, is impossible. All of this and the failure of Oslo to blossom into something more created massive disenchantment within the Palestinian population. And in 2000, after another spark, a second intifada erupts. This one far more violent, with suicide bombings and very high casualties. And leading this was Hamas, which was bent on destroying the Oslo process, which they thought was not leading anywhere. In 2004, Yasser Arafat dies. And in 2005, quite surprisingly, the Israelis unilaterally withdrew, as they call it, disengaged from Gaza. They destroyed their settlements. They didn't simply hand them over. They destroyed them and they left. Not out of charity, but because they thought Gaza was simply not worth the candle. And they'd rather focus their energies on the West Bank, which was far more valuable to them, especially because of its water. The president of the United States at the time was George W. Bush. Bush, as part of the Oslo spirit, encourages, pressures the Palestinian Authority to engage in election for their president, which they did, and for a legislative council to further democratize the authority. To everyone's surprise, Hamas agrees to participate in the elections. They had, after all, denounced anything resembling Oslo. Now they're participating in elections, and to everyone's even greater surprise, they do very well in the elections, campaigning on anti-corruption and on a vigorous opposition to the occupation. They do not win a majority of the vote, but because the Fatah opposition runs multiple candidates in districts, they end up cannibalizing themselves, and Hamas has a majority of the seats in the legislature and control of the prime ministership. They control the government. At the behest of Palestinian prisoners, Hamas and Fatah, the two major factions of the Palestinian resistance, are encouraged to form a unity government where both will participate. And Hamas and Fatah agreed to do this. In order to do this, Hamas much engaged in some acrobatics, some political acrobatics, where they agree to respect the Palestinian Authority's agreements with Israel, but not explicitly accepting them, nor explicitly recognizing Israel in the process, but neither impeding negotiations for a two-state settlement. They're simply going to stay out of the way. Later, they would propose a 10-year ceasefire with Israel, and if the Palestinian people wanted a two-state settlement, Hamas favors a single state, then they would agree, so long as the people voted this in a referendum, and Israel agreed that the state would have the pre-1967 borders, and they would acknowledge the Palestinian right of return. That's the refugees' right to return to their homes in Israel. The US and Israel were horrified by this electoral outcome and refused to recognize the results. They insisted that to do so, Hamas had to explicitly recognize Israel, explicitly embrace the Oslo peace accords, and explicitly renounce violence, all of which Hamas refused to do. Israel and the US then proceed to encourage an international restriction of aid to Gaza, which they successfully do, as I'll explain. Under such pressure, the Palestinian Authority led by Fatah buckles and they leave the unity government and they engage with Hamas in an armed struggle for control of Gaza. And even though the Palestinian Authority and Fatah have the military support of the United States and of Israel, Hamas defeats them in this contest, and Fatah is expelled, if you will, and now Hamas controls the government of Gaza. Israel responds by imposing a severe blockade of land, sea, and air, which remained in effect on October 7th, 2023, when the Hamas militants bursted through the security fence. In part, they're bursting through to break this, what had been at that time a 16-year siege that begins at this time. It's important to note that since 2007, there have been 4 major wars or armed conflicts between Israel and the authorities in Gaza in 2008 and 2009, in 2012 and 2014, and before 2023, a very short war of 11 days in 2021. Each of these has had very serious, very deleterious effects on Gazan society and on the built and natural environments. We can say that because Israel controls what goes in and outside of Gaza through their blockade and its use of permits, and I should note that Israel has what they call the dual use understanding of commodities, items which might look innocent to you or I, can have a military application in the eyes of the Israelis, and that can be banned. So if the Gazans seek to import steel pipe to repair water infrastructure, Israel might say, well, this could be used for weapon manufacturing, so we're not going to allow it in. The review process is very capricious, and it results in a very strict entry of what goes in and what goes out of Gaza. And because of this and the lack of funding, each conflict has had a rebuilding program that has been insufficient and always interdicted by the next campaign of violence before the first rebuilding program could be completed. So Gaza is in a state of constant repair and constant disrepair. In order to demonstrate to the world in a nonviolent way the desire to break this siege and to reassert the right of return, Palestinian civil society in Gaza organized the Great March of Return and Breaking the Siege, weekly marches to the security fence in 2018 and 2019. Some people call this the border fence. That is inaccurate. Israel has never declared their borders, never. So it's more accurate to call this a perimeter fence, a security barrier, if you will. And this protest was not welcomed by Israel. As we'll see, the Israelis establish a no-go zone of some 300 meters outside of this eastern perimeter barrier. Anyone who approaches it can be shot, and 214 Palestinians during this 2-year period were shot. Over 30,000 were wounded, with 200 limb amputations as a consequence. As you can see in this image, the perimeter barrier is flat, it's barren, but it used to be an area of abundant cropland with citrus groves and other crops growing. I'll explain in further detail in just a moment how this came about, but it's important that you see it as it is in this image. Okay, let's more systematically talk about the situation in Gaza from roughly 2007 until October 7th, 2023, looking at the effects of war and enforced enclosure. From 2007 to 2022, Gaza's GDP grows by only 1.1%, while the population grows by 61%. leading to a real GDP decline, a real GDP per capita decline of about 27%. The labor force accordingly grows 112%, but unemployment is at 45.3%, with youth unemployment over 60%, both numbers among the highest in the world. Some 2/3 of residents live in poverty, less than $2.50 a day, and 80% depend on international humanitarian assistance to survive. So it's a very dependent and straitened population. The intensity of military campaigns, according to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, resulted in an unprecedented humanitarian, environmental, and social catastrophe, and propelled Gaza from de-development to utter ruin. Israel does not allow the more abundant water of the West Bank to be transferred to Gaza. It prefers to use that water for its own population. Gaza relies primarily on the troubled coastal aquifer basin for its fresh water. However, this is very important to note, due to population pressures, the aquifer is vastly overdrawn, resulting in massive seawater infiltration. So seawater penetrates the fresh water supply of Gaza. Owing to high saline count and contamination from untreated wastewater and sewage and other pollutants, which I'll also talk about, some 97% of this water source, which historically had been a gift to Gaza for its agriculture and for its human beings and animals, is unfit for human consumption, even though 90% of water used in Gaza is drawn from underground wells using this water. 90% of Gazans also rely on water from desalination plants, some small scale and solar powered, delivered by mobile water tankers, which you can see what some of those look like. This is on the street where people can fill up containers. Others are much larger, look a bit more modern, which go to your home. But this is a financial burden for a population living in pronounced poverty. 10% of water comes from 3 Israeli pipelines operated by the Israeli national utility Nikorot. That is also water which must be paid for by the Palestinian Authority. And as we'll see, it can be turned on and off at will in times of conflict. Tap water, such as it exists, is polluted, very salty, and not fit for drinking. But in the absence of other alternatives, people use it for bathing and washing. So people always complain about skin irritation, about skin diseases because of the need to use this water. And yet even this water supply is irregular and unpredictable. Water purchased from private suppliers is used for drinking and cooking when possible. Note this, due to irregularities in supply, folks have to stock water on rooftop containers. You can see in the image on the right, the black containers are for water. And those are used on the days when the taps are dry. But the power supply in Gaza is also intermittent, which I'll talk about, and often doesn't come on at the same time as the water. So pumps can't be used to move the water from the ground to the rooftops. And if those containers cannot be filled, then people suffer. Prior to October 7th, 2023, some 70% of the Gazans had piped water, but only for 6 to 8 hours every 2 to 4 days. So water is a real hardship, and people schedule their life around when the taps come on, when electricity comes on, they'll race, they'll drop everything to try to get that water to the rooftops so they can have a supply for the week. The World Health Organization's minimum requirement for daily per capita water consumption is 100 liters, about 26 gallons. In Gaza, at this time, the average is about 88.3 liters. In Israel, by comparison, it's between 240 and 300 liters. After 10/7 till now, the consumption has dipped down to 4 liters per person per day, and even less at times, for reasons that we will discuss. The image on the left shows the corrosion of water infrastructure inside people's homes. People have to change their faucets regularly if they can, because they become so corroded due to the salty nature of the water that courses through them. Wastewater, including sewage, was largely untreated and was fed into the Mediterranean. In the image on the left, you see 90 million cubic meters of untreated waste dumped daily into the Mediterranean from pipes just like this. Given the overdrawn coastal aquifer, the contamination of the Mediterranean means that much of this water comes back into the aquifer. So the aquifer is not only filling up with salt water, but also with the contaminants from untreated waste. Gaza does have 5 wastewater treatment plants, 65 sewage pumping stations, and other water infrastructure, but almost all of them depend upon diesel fuel for power. And diesel fuel, like every other commodity, is metered by the Israelis, and its supply is usually inadequate to the task. It's important to note that prior to 10/7, some 26% of diseases in Gaza were waterborne related, and the major source of morbidity for children under 3. Completely preventable, but an ongoing reality. The image on the right is the modern-day wastewater treatment plant in Khan Yunis, which was built through international cooperation, a marvelous project, now in disuse because of the conflict. Food. As noted, at this time of extreme closure and siege, 80% of Gazans depended upon international humanitarian relief for survival, and an estimated 60% were still food insecure. In order to try to collapse Hamas and its government, Israel decided to literally meter the amount of food and food calories entering Gaza on a daily basis, settling on an average daily per person intake of 2,279 calories. This was expressed by the then Prime Minister Olmert's assistant, Dov Weisglass, who is said to have explained, "We must cause the Palestinians to become thinner but not die." A more frequent quotation was, "The idea is to put the Palestinians on a diet, but not to make them die of hunger." Weisglass denied making the remark, but food insecurity nonetheless skyrockets. Israel then eases this campaign after its deadly commando raid on the Turkish Mavi Marmara flotilla in 2010, a group of activists trying to break the siege, in which Israeli commandos board the ship, kill 9 people, a 10th dies later, and was a complete debacle for the Israelis, and at least got more food into Gaza. Prior to, again, 10/7, about 47% of the land in Gaza, despite being highly urbanized, was agricultural. People grow food between buildings, on the outskirts of cities. There's lots of urban gardening. Every spare meter is used for food where possible. Over half of farmland was used for fruits and vegetables, with wheat the main field crop. 44% of households, their food consumption depended upon local produce, the local production of domestic farmers. 40% relied on local fruits and vegetables. The rest came from imports. Well, farm products made up some half of Gaza's exports. So at a time when food is very short, people rely heavily on local food production. Now more about the perimeter buffer. At this time, Israel is enforcing what they call access restricted area on their on Gaza's eastern border with Israel. It's fenced along the length of the border, and it becomes a prohibited zone, with farmers unable to access 300 meters west of the perimeter, and another 100 puts them at risk of being shot for simply being there and trying to farm. Since 2014, the Israeli military has engaged in aerial spraying of this area. While Israel says that it sprays only on its side of the fence, there is, of course, wind, and forensic architecture, a research outfit at Goldsmiths University, London, has documented how spraying occurs on days where the wind blows to the west and invades Palestinian crops. And herbicides are used, such as glyphosate, the active ingredient Roundup, which we all know about, and it has resulted in the scorching and destruction of vegetation on the Gazan side of the border, such that it looks like the barren landscape that we saw in the Great March of Return image. The leaf is of chard, which has been damaged by the herbicides, and the color photography shows the wafting of the herbicides over the perimeter fence into Gaza. Palestinians have tried to stop this by suing in Israeli courts. They've been denied, but Israeli farmers have been successful when the wind blows the other way and damages their crops. Spraying has helped to scorch and flatten the eastern perimeter, to establish clear lines of sight for military snipers, and to establish a kind of panopticon of constant monitoring and surveillance of the buffer land. The Israeli military also mandated a 1 meter height for crops, which effectively outlaws trees. Remember, this area had been rich in citrus and olive trees, no longer so. In fact, the Yafa or Shamuti orange pictured below was a core component of a vibrant citriculture that stretched from Gaza southward to Yafa in the north, and like the olive, was a mainstay of Palestinian identity, linking Gaza to the rest of Palestine and to the markets of the Mediterranean, Europe, and Asia. During the occupation, groves were bulldozed to make way for settlements, roads, and security facilities, and farmers have begun to shift to less culturally significant crops, low-lying crops, I should say low-growing crops, like strawberries, watermelons, cherry tomatoes, and herbs. More recently, given Israel's control over export permitting, where sometimes strawberries sit on trucks on the Gaza side of the border, unable to exit and perish, some farmers have begun shifting to the growth of pineapples, which are less perishable, a further colonization of the food mix imposed by Israeli security concerns. The olive tree deserves special attention. The beloved olive tree is a living symbol of Palestinians' attachment to the land, growing in poor soil, drought-resistant, protected by thick spiraling trunks, and bearing fruit and enduring for centuries before the occupation. It embodies the essence of what the Palestinians call sumud, or steadfastness. Since 1967, some 800,000 olive trees throughout Palestine, West Bank, and Gaza have been uprooted, burned, or otherwise destroyed to make room for Jewish-only settlements, deny cover to militants, and to erase the cultural presence of Palestinians. Just as concrete was once preferred by Israelis to avoid the stone architecture of the indigenous, and European conifers were chosen over other varieties to effect an Orientalist landscaping planted on the ruins of local villages destroyed during the Nakba to render the past invisible, so too the destruction of olive trees helped the project of dissolving the native and diluting the Levantine look of the land. It's interesting to note that in Deuteronomy 20:19, there are many translations of this, so I don't know if this one is a standard one, but I'll just read it because it's touching in some ways. When you mount an attack on a town and the siege goes on a long time, don't start cutting down the trees, swinging your axes against them. Those trees are your future food. Don't cut them down. Are trees soldiers who come against you with weapons? Apparently so. Electricity, power. A single central power plant in Gaza generated about 1/4 of electricity before 2023. And there were 12 power lines from Israel that provided about half the power. But collectively, This meant less than half the demand for electricity, with rolling blackouts about 11 hours each day. And Israeli supplied electricity and fuel for generating the plant were unreliable and subject to interdiction for political and security considerations. Gaza has invested heavily in renewable energy, especially solar. With some 320 days of sunshine and having many buildings with flat roofs, Gazans deployed many rooftop solar installations that accounted for, at its peak, about 25% of electrical generation, one of the highest in the world. A March 2023 estimate counted about 12,400 rooftop solar systems, covering about 1/3 of the population, over 50% of businesses. And the satellite image you see on the right shows a square mile concentration of solar installations, which is said to be one of the densest ever recorded. Still, electrical supply was insufficient and greatly affects, of course, the purity and the distribution of water. You could say that fuel is power, and without power, water distribution and purification runs into serious obstacles. Solar helped, but it was not a cure-all. Again, prior to 2023, Gaza was subject to extreme movement restrictions on people and goods, further isolating the enclave from the rest of Palestine and the world. The land, sea, and air blockade very much exacerbated previous restrictions, limiting the number and specified categories of people and goods allowed in and out through Israeli-controlled crossings and the permit systems. Before the Second Intifada in 2000, there were 500,000 monthly exits allowed to Israel, mainly for work. That dipped down to less than 11,000 during the blockade, and far less during periods of crisis. Maybe more interesting or important, the number of commercial truckloads taking Gaza exports out of Gaza dropped precipitously from a pre-blockade monthly high of 961 to as low as 2, and then a sort of average of 787 thereafter. And the monthly volume of commercial trucks entering Gaza with aid fell 30%, even as the population during the first 15 years of the closure rose 50%. So there's a expanding need, but less means to fulfill it at this time. By destroying the Yasser Arafat International Airport in 2001, and then definitively in 2002, Israel further isolated Gaza and made residents feel even more imprisoned. Israeli forces also restricted access off the coast, allowing fisherfolk to utilize 6 to 12 nautical miles, even though the Oslo Accord provided for 20 nautical miles. This greatly affected livelihood and food security. Boats and nets were routinely seized, sometimes destroyed, and fisherfolk were chased, harassed, and sometimes killed as they tried to skirt the restrictions. Gaza farmers, despite the closures, managed to sustain a vibrant small-scale agriculture. In 2022, they exported some $44 million worth of foodstuffs, but they were only allowed to export to a handful of neighboring locales and countries, such as most to the West Bank, to Israel, a bit to the Gulf Cooperation Council countries like Bahrain, United Arab Republic, and the remainder to Jordan. So export markets are throttled at the discretion of the Israeli authorities. In 2012, the United Nations country team and the occupied Palestinian territories issued a report, Gaza in 2020, a livable place. And they asked the question, will Gaza be a livable place in 2020? Looking at the trajectories at the time, they argued it would barely be so and would require Herculean efforts to reverse the trends. Later in 2015, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development issued a report of its own, arguing that the 3 wars that occurred in the previous 6 years, as well as the 8 years of economic blockade, quote, have ravaged the already debilitated infrastructure of Gaza, shattered its productive base, left no time for meaningful reconstruction or economic recovery, and impoverished the Palestinian population of Gaza. The report also responded to the question of will Gaza be a livable place in 2020 and argued it will not be. It will not be livable in 2020. Rubble. The 4 major military operations targeting Gaza in 2008-9, 2012, 2014, and 2021 have left mounds of rubble. It takes on average 10 to 20 days to clear a building that has been destroyed of rubble, depending upon its size. If we think about this comparatively in Haiti during the 2010 earthquake, the 7.0 Richter scale quake that killed between 220,000 and 300,000 people, that generated 8.8 million tons of rubble. And 3 years later, they had cleared 80% of it. During the 11-day conflict in Gaza alone, the briefest of the conflicts, some 2,000 homes were destroyed, 22,000 damaged, displacing tens of thousands of people, and generating between 200,000 and 300,000 tons of rubble. Much of this had not been cleared by the time the October 7th conflict erupted. Again, due to the dual use constraints, lack of funding, Gazans have learned to recycle and repurpose rubble, which is depicted in the images at the bottom. Debris is sorted, metal is removed and straightened, concrete, which is serviceable, is crushed and repurposed into low-quality concrete used for roadways, fences, and buildings, but not to be risked in high-quality construction, doing the best they can. All right, let's talk about what's happened since October 7th, 2023, beginning with death, injuries, and the missing as part of our accounting of the social impact of the conflict. The still rising death toll by mid-November, it's even higher as I look today, is roughly 43,764, with 103,000 plus injured, over 10,000 missing. The missing, of course, are thought to be under the rubble. Earlier this month, the UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, using a much smaller sample size, estimated that based on their verification, some almost 70% of the casualties are women and children. So one has to ask, if that's the case, as the Western media depicts this as a war between Israel and Hamas, does that really make sense to depict it that way, if 3/4 of the casualties are not Hamas fighters? Equally, given indirect mortality in the coming months and years from causes such as reproductive, communicable, and non-communicable diseases, which typically range from between 3 and 15 times the number of direct deaths from conflict, it's easy to understand that the actual death count is likely much higher. And if we simply used a number of 5 to multiply by the current death rate, we get over 200,000 people, which approaches 10% of the population, which is a staggering number under any measure. So many people said this count is certainly an undercount, which will grow in the years to come, even as the fighting stops. Although Israel has barred international journalists from entering Gaza, except those who go under military escort, many Gazan journalists and some who managed to get in from Egypt have reported and have been targeted by the military campaign. Reporters Without Borders argues that over 130 journalists have been killed. The Gaza Media Office, which has a looser definition of journalists, counts at least 175. It's the most dangerous place in the world today to be a journalist. The scale of destruction. Shafak News on September 8th reported over 80,000 tons of explosives have been dropped on Gaza since October 7th in the first 11 months of the conflict. Most reports had put 75,000. This one says 80,000. Certainly by now, that is at least the case. And it has transformed the landscape into being unrecognizable. According to satellite image analysis, almost 60% of Gaza has been damaged or destroyed. The governorates are listed in the slide showing the percentage of destruction. It's quite staggering, such that even after this stops, the rebuilding is just monumental. And given how in the past reconstruction has always been halted by further conflict, one has to be very pessimistic about what is in store for Gazans going forward. Food today, at least 2.15 million people, or 96%, are food insecure. They face a severe lack of food. 1 in 5 face starvation, according to the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, which of course is the international body which designates areas where famine is impending or has taken effect. The situation is more dire still in the north, a place north of the Netzarim corridor, which I'll talk about in a moment, where a siege and kill cage has descended in accordance with the so-called general's plan. I won't talk about this in depth, but because I mentioned it repeatedly, let me just say that there is a former Israeli head of the Security Council, Giora Eiland, who has long talked about the need to not simply fight Hamas with weapons, but to engage in a starvation and epidemic policy, where it's good if Gazans don't have sanitation. This will induce epidemics and disease. It will kill women and children, which is not, he argues, intended to be cruel, but simply to hasten an end to the war. And if we cut off food, well, then Hamas cannot fight and they will surrender and the war will be over. This is a sort of more humane way to end a savage war. Well, in September, October, a modified version of this was put into effect in an area of North Gaza and Gaza City, where they're essentially imposing a full siege. It was this full siege the Biden administration responded to, giving Israel 30 days to increase the supply of aid, which we'll talk about in a moment. But this is a ghastly situation. So if food insecurity is very bad south of this area, it's extremely bad to the north. And it has been said in exactly this way by almost a dozen international aid agencies who continue to complain that it must stop. Again, some 47% of Gaza is agricultural, but according to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, some 68% of farmland has been damaged after a year of war. And in under 6 months, a significant amount of farming infrastructure, like greenhouses in particular, have been rendered inoperable. Wells, greenhouses, barns, and the like have been destroyed. Fishing. As of July 2024, at least 120 fisherfolk have been killed as they try to ply the waters of the coast, which Israel regards as a combat zone. They do this out of desperation because they need food, they need to make money for their families, but it's not tolerated. Boats and equipment are being destroyed by the IDF, as you can see. In the image on the right, you see boats covered in sand. That's to protect them from white phosphorus munitions, which are an incendiary, which I'll also talk about in just a moment. So it's a very bad situation for the fisher folk. This requires, I think, our attention. Satellite images reveal mass demolitions of farmlands, homes, and public buildings along the stretch up to at least 1 kilometer deep on the Gaza side of the eastern perimeter border, amounting to an estimated 16% of the enclave's territory and some 35% of pre-war cropland. So they've expanded the no-go zone at the eastern perimeter. The IDF, the Israeli military, is also taking control of the Netzarim corridor, which is this area here. Sorry, Zoomers. Do I have it? I don't have cursor control. I guess I do. I don't know if you can't see that. It's the area that cuts North Gaza from South Gaza. This area had Israeli settlements, which were abandoned in 2005. This area has now been retaken, a roadway that cut across. The width of Gaza has been much widened. And if you include the Netzarim corridor, which Israel uses as a way to separate the two halves of Gaza from each other, and the expansion of the periphery, Gaza has lost some 32% of its territory in this way. 32% has been lost to Israeli military control. So we might say that it may not, this is a kind of neo-Nakba. It may not be possible to transfer, that is, to expel Gazans out of Gaza, as many have feared. It may not be politically possible to do that. But what you can do is squeeze them to make room for future Jewish-only resettlement, which is actively talked about in Israel. And this would gift, in scare quotes, reduced Palestinian areas with insufferable amounts of density. So you can pack them into the southern part of Gaza without expelling them, make life even more miserable, and the Israelis can resettle northern part of Gaza, not because they want to necessarily, but for security considerations and because the settler movement is demanding it. And it looks like they're at least for the time being, having some influence. Just last week, a leader of the settlement movement was invited by the army to tour North Gaza, which was a signal that maybe they're really serious about reestablishing settlements there. We'll see. I won't go through all of this, but in the governorates and cities close to the perimeter fence have also been bulldozed and cleared of structures and homes, suggesting a further shrinkage of Gaza beyond the 32% of the perimeter fence expansion in the Netzarim corridor. So Gazans are feeling really squeezed and are wondering if this will simply be a temporary measure, whether this bodes a more permanent shrinkage of Gaza. So as Gaza is being shrunk, flattened, and contaminated mercilessly in the course of this military campaign. You may have heard of the Philadelphia Corridor, which is the name of the border area between Israel, Egypt, and Gaza. It's the only border that Gaza has that isn't with Israel, land border that isn't with Israel. The Israelis retook this border after agreeing to leave it in the Camp David peace accords in the 1970s, arguing that they need to be there to destroy tunnels that Hamas has used from Gaza into Egypt, which is a smuggling vehicle for arms and other proscribed products. Egypt insists that they've already destroyed the tunnels and that the Israeli presence risks their treaty arrangements with Israel, which is a very serious matter. And they've insisted that they move, but they're not moving. And I mention this simply because this has been used to throttle peace negotiations. As Hamas has said, we will not negotiate a ceasefire or return of the captives unless you leave this area, because they desperately don't want to be enclosed entirely by Israel on its land borders. And it's said that the Israeli government has intentionally done this to thwart negotiations, to prolong the war for political reasons that we needn't go into, but I think you may have heard of. And of course, if they wish, since they're there, they could expand this buffer zone and take further territory, and there'd be nothing that could be done about that. As I noted before the war, 80% were dependent upon international humanitarian relief. The collapse of the domestic food system and water systems has made this dependency comprehensive. Everyone now depends upon international assistance. But every aid agency you can think of, even those that are no longer there because they've been frustrated and have left, blame Israel for slow walking truck inspections and obstructing the delivery of assistance at a time of circling famine. As I mentioned, in October, the Biden administration gave Israel 30 days to improve matters. Most organizations argued they did not, but the administration had threatened to cut off military assistance if they didn't improve. They argued that while things are not perfect, there was some improvement, so we're simply going to allow Israel to continue receiving military assistance. But as I mentioned, in the north, the situation has not changed. And Haaretz reported just last week, on the 16th, that 3 aid vehicles were allowed in the north during this 30-day period. 2 of them, aid trucks, 1 a water tanker. But when Palestinians came out to get the supplies, they were shot at, so they had to leave. And the school where the supplies were left was burned, indicating that the general's plan is alive and well. They're not going to allow this area to be resupplied. They want to depopulate it as quickly as possible. Electricity, after the October 7th attacks, the Israeli energy minister declared that no electric switch will be turned on, no water tap will be opened, no fuel truck will enter Gaza until the Israeli abductees are home. They followed through on this threat. They cut the direct supply initially to Gaza and embargoed deliveries of diesel fuel, causing the only central power plant to shut down. Private generators also, over time, ran out of supply. They also shut down. Many power lines related to infrastructure were damaged, have been damaged. It'll likely take years to rehabilitate them, and adding to the previous unfinished rehabilitations. Due to international outcry, fuel has been resumed, but it's inadequate to the need. And there's even less sanitation being supplied today than the period before October 7th, which, as we noted, was already borderline horrific. Now it's even worse. Given that some 66% of structures in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed, many rooftop solar systems have not survived. While no longer providing 25% of Gaza's electricity, remaining solar panels have become a lifeline for the beleaguered population, allowing some hospitals and clinics to remain partially functional and enabling cell phones to be charged. In the image below, that shop charged about 25 cents to charge a phone. That's how people can maintain their phones. Absent those phones, the world would know far less about the war and its consequences inside Gaza. And also, it serves as a means for people to connect with family and people outside Gaza and provides them with a degree of agency and dignity, both of which have been stripped during this conflict. Water, as I mentioned, before the conflict, 88 or so liters per day per person was the average in Gaza. 100, of course, is the minimum. Today, it's gone down to between, well, less than 2 at times. Oxfam in July noted that Israel's cutting of the external water supply, the systematic destruction of water facilities, and the deliberate obstruction of and reduced amount of water available in Gaza slipped by 94% to 4.7 liters per person per day. That is just a third of the emergency amount of 15 liters per day, and less than a single toilet flush. So people are hanging on by a thread when it comes to water usage. And aid agencies complain that folks are always at risk of dehydration. By July, the destruction of water, including hundreds of wells and electrical infrastructure and restrictions on the entry of spare parts to and fuel to, again, rehabilitate damaged infrastructure, saw water production drop by 84% in Gaza, and the external supply by Mikorot, the Israeli utility, dropped by 78%. In September, the UN reported that all 3 water connection points from Israel were partially functional, but not fully functional. And it was still the case that some 95% of Gazans had been without sufficient supply of clean water. Desperation has driven many to drink the salty water and to bathe and wash clothes in the sea, which people regard as, of course, suboptimal, a health hazard, and an affront to their dignity. Largely through explosive munitions, the military has destroyed some 70% of all sewage pumps, and all of Gaza's wastewater treatment plants, all 5 of them, are down. Even the wastewater testing laboratory has been hit. Lack of fuel to treat solid waste and wastewater, of course, allows untreated sewage to enter the streets and the Mediterranean, where, of course, it flows back into the groundwater through the infiltration of seawater. The presence of heavy metals, of contaminants, including diseased corpses, which are extremely problematic, have no way to be addressed. The problem, as I mentioned, existed before October 7th, but the magnitude is unprecedented today. As people sought shelter in schools, hospitals, mosques, and churches, the few available bathrooms to be shared among hundreds of thousands of people is now a trauma. People waiting in lines for hours. Efforts by UNICEF and the Palestine Red Crescent Society to bring in portable toilets and materials to build toilets were denied by Israel. So makeshift solutions where people dig holes and fill them, use plastic bags and toss them on beaches and open areas is now ever-present, an ever-present reality if you look close in Gaza. Garbage collection has ceased, rubbish piles on thoroughfares and empty spaces, adding to the already conducive breeding ground for infectious disease. If the war's landscape is explosions and the unrelenting buzz of ever-present surveillance and attack drones, its atmosphere is the unavoidable dust, squalor, and stench. As I mentioned, at least 80,000 tons of bombs have been dropped on Gaza, which exceeds the combined total used against Dresden, Hamburg, and London during World War II. Much larger cities over a much longer period of time. The vast majority of these bombs are US-made, including the Joint Direct Attack munitions in the form of precision-guided 1,000 and 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs. These bombs, upon impact, liquefy ground and pancake buildings, such that the bombs don't actually have to hit the buildings to collapse them. They simply hit the ground around them, the ground collapses, the buildings collapse, which is, if you watch videos, you see this time and time again. This actually amplifies the blast, which has potential for more collateral damage. I don't think I need to say much more about that. Contamination from bombs and bombing. Bombing is more than explosions. It's fundamentally a chemical process with chemical contaminant residues. Tritonol or TNT accounts for a large portion of the explosive-related contamination in Gaza and presents various health and environmental concerns, including soil and water contamination, which are the gateways for human exposure. Many conventional bombs also contain the explosive chemical RDX, which has become infamous in the United States, where it has fouled soil and water across the country in military bases. Smoke from the blast of bombs are especially hazardous since buildings contain toxics like furniture, foams, treated lumber, and household chemicals. Burning plastic bags as fuel adds to the danger of breathing in Gaza. And this is especially alarming. Risk from exposure to asbestos in smoke or airborne fibers and particulates is especially high. 2.3 million tons of debris may contain it, especially in the 8 refugee camps where it was extensively used for insulation and roofing. It may have as much as 800,000 tons of debris contaminated with it. That is unbelievable to me. Rubble may also contain sandflies, which cause serious skin ailments. Yellow scorpions and vipers can also nest in crevices, making them really hazardous. Areas of flooded sewage underneath the rubble can also provide an environment for insects like mosquitoes. posing a further risk for transmissible diseases. As noted, flooded sewage can also have long-term effects on the underground water. Dust, I think this doesn't get enough attention. If you look carefully at video from Gaza, you see people and dust everywhere. Buildings are heavily bombed. Bombs are breaking up concrete. There's dust. The dust is full of contaminants. It's an insidious toxic threat. One need only recall what happened to emergency responders after 9/11 in the United States when they went to, pick through rubble of the World Trade Centers, how that impacted health very seriously, leading to a lot of premature death. Wind and rain can carry the contaminants in dust like asbestos to areas far beyond where they were dropped and far beyond where the debris has been moved. So it's an ever-present hazard, and to me has not gotten sufficient attention. White phosphorus. White phosphorus is a chemical made of phosphate rock, ignites when exposed to oxygen, continues to burn at very high temperatures until exhausted or the oxygen is snuffed. It has incendiary effects and can set fire to structures and burn through flesh to bone, which is why it's not supposed to be used in conflict for this reason. It can also be used for signaling and marking targets, and because of its intense heat, it generates lots of white smoke, which is used to camouflage troop movements. But when used in crowded areas like Gaza, Gaza is all crowded. There's no sort of a desolate place. It is considered to be a potential war crime, and it has been used extensively at the beginning of the conflict. Gaza in the past has also suffered from depleted uranium munitions, which of course has in places in the world, like in Kosovo and Iraq, has generated cancer clusters. I'm not aware of this being used this time around, but white phosphorus, yes, and it can contaminate soil and water with the buildup of phosphoric acid, also diminishing soil fertility in an area which desperately needs to be able to produce their own food. The debris scale is enormous. My estimate is that there are some 248,000 structures in Gaza. 2/3, or approximately 163,000, have been destroyed or damaged after just 1 year of bombardment, and of course it continues. There's also been shelling and intentional demolitions, which we've seen with the universities. Satellite imagery also suggests 42 million tons of rubble, which of course continues to mount. That's 14 times the amount generated from all the wars in Gaza from 2008 until this one. The UN Environmental Program calculates it'll take 14 years to clear the rubble and explosive remnants. You can see the comparison there between the damage done during this conflict with the one in 2014, which prior to this time was the most extensive one in Gaza. The damage is considerably greater this time around, and it continues. According to United Nations satellite imagery, among the buildings damaged are some 200,000 plus housing units, leaving most of the population homeless. This has sparked outcry, and just last month, in September, it was formally proposed that domicide, the intentional destruction of homes, be considered a war crime. This is now be considered to be incorporated in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. It's not just Gaza. There have been other conflicts where this has happened, but Gaza sort of puts an exclamation point on this matter. Healthcare systems. Of the 36 hospitals in Gaza, none is now fully functional. 34 have been put out of service, including Al-Shifa, depicted on the right. There are 9 field hospitals, 4 fully operational, but they cannot make up the difference between the 34 knocked out hospitals. We all know the stories about inadequate facilities, supplies, amputations happening without benefit of anesthetic, quite horrible. Almost 1,000 medical workers have been killed at this time. Many have been detained by Israeli authorities. The UN has determined that the raids and bombing of medical facilities constitutes medicide, a criminal act of intentionally targeting medical facilities. Again, in North Gaza, at a time when the generalist plan is being pursued, we can only imagine things are just far worse. Infectious disease, after a year of war, estimated 1.7 million people have been infected with contagious diseases due to, of course, lack of sanitation, access to hygiene, and compromised immune systems from constant stress and inadequate diet. Diarrhea remains a real concern for young children. I won't go through the numbers, but there have been many requests for exit out of Gaza to treat cancer patients and those who simply can't be cared for in Gaza. Most have been denied. Some have been allowed, especially for children, but most not. So this is why many say the death count will mount even after the cessation of hostilities, as these people meet an unfortunate demise. It should be noted, though, that just recently, the second round of a polio vaccination campaign was completed after an outbreak. Any population that had been highly vaccinated, but an outbreak occurred due to the breakdown of sanitation and the like. But again, in the north, not everyone could be ministered to. And so that remains a concern. I'm not going to make it. People can turn off if they want to. I'm going to continue. We also have the assaulting of cultural institutions. All of Gaza's 12 universities have been destroyed. People have talked about the number of schools being targeted as constituting what they call scholasticide, the intentional destruction of educational institutions. 750,000 students do not have schools to attend. Many teachers and administrators have been killed. And of course, many schools repurposed for shelters. Many mosques have been destroyed, hundreds, including the Great Omari Mosque. All 3 churches in Gaza have been targeted, damaged. This is also regarded as insulting by Gazans. And even for amusements, like at the Asta'a in Khan Yunis, the biggest amusement park has been rendered unoperational, and like the beaches of Gaza, which were once frequented by many people for relaxation, all those things remain simply in memory. The challenges of cleanup and healing require lots of personnel, heavy equipment, fuel, all of which are controlled by Israel. Gaza lacks the space to store all the debris. It's estimated they'll require 2 square miles of area to put the debris. The landfill used last time around is now an Israeli military zone. Again, the UN estimates 14 years at a cost of $1.2 billion just to remove the rubble. And again, the toxins in the rubble make this a precarious undertaking. And small matters like property rights having to be respected to get permission to remove rubble. Many proprietors have died, property lines have blurred, and property records are probably gone up in smoke. So this is also a challenge, of course, not to mention how to deal with the corpses lying beneath the rubble. The estimate is that there's 7,500 tons of unexploded ordnance. People have been killed, especially picking up canisters that look like food, which is now a major way in which food is consumed. People pull the top thinking that they're simply ring poles, but they're fuses. And people have died and been badly injured. The UN and NGOs have done a massive leafleting campaign to explain to people, which I think they already know, the dangers of mistaking food for unexploded ordnance. Damage to the soil is long-lasting from all the contaminants, from the accelerated presence of waste, the chemicals from munitions. All this remains a massive challenge going forward, and one wonders how this will be managed. Many have said Gaza is now a textbook case of ecocide in every imaginable way. The use of jet fuel to bomb use of jet fuel to run cargo missions from the United States and elsewhere to and from Israel, the use of jet fuel to send supplies, use of trucks running diesel to run supplies, the munitions explosions, all this has massive effects on the environment, on the atmosphere, and emissions. The greenhouse gas emissions have not been calculated. It's estimated that militaries alone account for 5.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions, which are larger than all but 3 countries' emissions, the US, China, and India. And one has to guess that this war has also contributed at a time when we can't afford this. And the scary part is that the estimates for rebuilding, where concrete alone generates huge amounts of emissions, will contribute to this in even higher levels. The concluding slide. Military historian Robert Pape argues that Gaza is one of the most intense civilian punishment campaigns in history. It now sits comfortably in the top quartile of the most devastating bombing campaigns ever. Architectural historian Mark Jazambek argues what we see in Gaza is something that we have never seen before in the history of urbanism. No matter what one does, for generations, Gaza will be struggling with this. The magnitude of destruction has, of course, prompted allegations of domicide, as I mentioned, herbicide, scholasticide, medicide, cultural genocide, and ecocide. Francesca Albanese, the special rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Palestine, in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967, argues that the totality of the onslaught indicates genocide, especially one line from the Genocide Convention prohibiting deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. I don't know quite how to end an accounting such as this, but since the first slide began with a poem, I'll end it with a poem, which I hope is not taken as insulting, but I think it has some wisdom, where it's often the case that victims of violence find it easier to forgive than those who perpetrate it, since the perpetrators have to admit what they've done. Rafid Al-Arir was a poet in Gaza, a very famous poet who was, we know, targeted for death in the early days of the campaign. He was killed along with members of his family. And he writes Gaza writes back, if a Palestinian bulldozer were ever invented, haha, I know, and I were given the chance to be in an orchard in Haifa, for instance, I would never uproot a tree an Israeli planted. No Palestinian would. To Palestinians, the tree is sacred, and so is the land bearing it. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Alan.
Want to come up here, Moshkan? Yeah, sorry to do this to you.
I just want to say thank you for pulling this information together to share with all of us. I think this is a tremendous amount of information to take in, and I just want to thank you for sharing it with us, and the time and the care and the thought that you did for that. So thank you for that. I want to open this up for questions. I have my own thoughts and questions, but anyone in the room or on the chat and Zoom has questions, we're happy to take them. I'm going to take a peek at the questions real quick over here. There are already some questions.
I have a good one. Like you talked about the role of the United Nations in the settlements initially, and the shock when Israel decides to ban President of the nation more recently. And I feel like there's a cycle there. I don't know how to connect it. I mean, I don't know to connect it. The crisis of democratic systems, the crisis of whatever we want to connect it to, but there seems to be an arch here of injustice, right? Of going from a highly idealistic in one way, but also imperfect institution of the United Nations that had at times helped and at times over the atrocities. But there was that equilibrium of you have to make it look good, acceptable, even when they were covering atrocities, right? But now we're at a point where the atrocity can be there, can happen in the absence of any attempt of justification in accordance to the principles that have informed the way we ran the world that we ran. So the worst people. So why, I mean, could you contextualize the crisis of from the legal nations to United Nations to like, no, we don't even need it.
Yeah. So for those on Zoom, the question from Adolfo was essentially, what are we to think about the United Nations and its commitment to humanitarianism when there's an ongoing potential genocide happening and it's done precious little? What are we to make of that? I mean, I think there's great willingness within the United Nations to do something, but the UN is built to be like the US government, to be checked and balanced. It's run by the Security Council, where the 5 permanent members are given a veto. And at this point, the United States stands in the way. The Biden administration is unbelievably supportive of Israel and has thwarted efforts in the UN, which there have been many, to try to stop this. I think you may have been alluding to Israeli forces attacking UN observers in Lebanon. And recently, the Knesset passed a law where they banned UNRWA, the principal agency, the UN agency taking care of Palestinians. That won't take effect for 90 days, so there's time to change that. But so the UN is being insulted, and it's not doing anything. But I think there's great willingness to do so, but they're really institutionally powerless to act unless they get buy-in from the 5 permanent members. There is a mechanism to do this, the Uniting for Peace resolution, where the General Assembly, in a majority vote, can essentially seize control of the Security Council if it's blocked, unable to act in a matter of international peace and security. They've not done this. There have been many suggestions by international scholars to do this, but I think people are wary of moving against the United States and having their trade relations compromised, their security relations compromised, so they don't do it. And of course, this will likely become even less likely when the next administration takes over. So it is a blight on the body. And many have said that they're waiting for the decision of the International Court of Justice to rule on their genocide finding. And in late October, South Africa submitted its final evidence. Israel will have until July of next year to submit its evidence, then the court will make a decision. Folks have said if the court does not rule that this is a genocide, it will eviscerate all international humanitarian law, since everyone can see what's been happening. It is not just Gaza that's in some sense on trial, Israel is on trial. The whole international system is on trial. And if it fails to deliver, this will have catastrophic consequences for international understandings of humanitarianism everywhere, for everything. So it is unbelievable that a body created to address matters of war and peace has been immobilized to do anything constructive, except to finger wag. And to the Secretary General's credit, he's been, I think, marvelous in speaking out, but it's had no effect whatsoever. He has no power other than to jawbone the members, and he's simply being ignored. So I don't know what to say. It is a crisis. It does fit in with the larger picture that you mentioned about the crisis of democratic republics in general. This is part of it, where you have voices of ordinary people demanding redress and nothing being done. And how long this can continue before there is a snap in all kinds of systems remains to be seen. But we could be on the verge of something even more catastrophic, or on the verge of something far more humane, as people get really frustrated watching this unfold before their eyes. So it's a great question. That's the best answer I can provide at the moment.
I just wanted to also add that like all of what you shared is devastating in so many ways, and it's amazing to me, like the situation that you're describing, right? That is happening in Gaza. This is like a major public health crisis. These are and as you discussed, there are legacies of this contamination that will impact people for decades. I know that like certain metals and other environmental contaminants from bombing in Iraq, like there's associated birth defects
Yes.
and miscarriage rates that have been accounted for. And frankly, we don't even have good data on that. And I'm like, how are we ever going to know what these true impacts are?
That's true.
And when people catalog the deaths and the injuries and the mortality in Gaza, people aren't going to be looking at 10 years from now when people die of asbestosis or, you know, these other things. And so it's not a question. It's just really devastating from this kind of environmental justice perspective
Yes.
of like, and public health perspective of like, there's so much more in terms of the catastrophe that
Yes,
we don't even account for regularly. So
I agree.
you know,
I agree, 100%.
I don't know what to ask about that. Just sad.
It's true. Yeah.
Are there other questions or comments?
I mean, it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming before you present it. It's overwhelming as information. What do you think humane could possibly happen in response? I get pushed to a place of saying large scale human settlement on the planet is itself unfeasible, unsustainable. We're not capable of making just decisions at the scale at which we're attempting to live globally. If you, and I do this too, I ask myself, Jim, that just means Gaza is going to be repeated until our species is reduced to something more livable or goes extinct. And then I push myself to say, what's an alternative? What if there is some way to try to be something different? So I'm just asking you to play out what you think could be a humane response, given that when push comes to shove, the UN can't do anything because finally you have to have violent power behind you to be able to threaten the United States or any other player to stop them. Otherwise,
Right.
can you imagine anything nonviolent that would counter the resolve of the US, of Netanyahu, of Putin, of China, that comes to that?
Can I imagine? Yeah. Can I imagine a nonviolent solution given the leaders and institutions that we have today?
Humane solution,
Humane-
just, I don't care what we call them.
Yeah, not really. Quite honestly,
Yeah,
I mean,
okay, neither.
we were sitting at the moment, Gaza aside, we're in a climate free fall. Everyone who's sane understands this. There's no shortage of information, yet it keeps getting worse. And this year may be the first in which the average surface temperature is above 1.5 degrees, which is the target. Everyone knows it's the target, and efforts have been fully inadequate. And I was just reading in the New York Times about Saudi Arabia and their efforts to torpedo further movement and a transition to green energy. And of course, we know what's coming here on January 20th. So that alone makes one very skeptical that the message simply hasn't gotten across in meaningful ways. So it leads one to be very pessimistic, except that I think that, if I can put it this way, the people of Gaza have to feel there's something more. And I think out of respect for them, we have to feel so too. I mean, it's sort of a luxury to feel that you have
Yeah.
no choice. We have choices, and we know that the alternatives are dire, and it's our responsibility to at least talk about possibilities. And I think this is so lame, and it's what an academic will always say, but we do too little of talking about possibilities. We're too busy digging out of holes rather than thinking about how to turn things around in more humane ways. So right now there's I mean, you and Lily, frequent circles where this is talked about in meaningful ways and people take it very seriously, know a lot, but to the general public, it doesn't exist. And if it does, it's naive talk. But I think, unfortunately, as things get worse and worse, it'll be easier to talk about this, and also perhaps too late to talk about it. But I think that's what we still have to do. There's no choice. We simply have to talk about it, and where possible, model it and live it. And at least, you and Lily talk about living with beauty. And I think living with dignity as well is important, as we are encircled by the very opposites. What else can we do?
We've been attending a film series at Wayne on Palestine, and going Monday nights in the fall. But it's telling that in the first 2 weeks, the numbers were 45, 50 folks. Last time we were there, less than 20. And Palestinian voices that are foregrounded on the panel after each video are themselves saying they don't have anything practical to offer. They expect it to get worse. The only hope is a kind of long-term collapsing of Israel on itself. But it's not very specific.
Right.
Many of them pre-election saying, vote for Jill Stein because we can't let a Biden-Harris genocidal administration get away with being reelected, even though they understood Trump would be worse. Democracy Now! Later this week reporting that Palestinians on the ground in Gaza looking at the election results say, well, we know it will be the same, but with Trump, at least we'll die more quickly. Trump will not be dishonest about what he's doing. So that's what I'm hearing from Palestinians.
Yeah.
And I agree with you, it's not an option to resign to sitting back and drinking my coffee and watching video. What can we do?
Can I just respond to Jim for a second? I think one thing, this is just pure speculation. There's nothing to ground it on, but Trump may surprise. He's so unpredictable. He's so transactional. We just never know.
Yeah, it's true.
But the fanatics that he's put in charge as ambassador for the U.S. to Israel, that alone creates great pause.
So, not to be
Right, exactly. Yeah. Lily.
see much unpredictability there.
Right.
But I am just so glad that you ended with the words of Rifat Talarir.
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking in terms of implications for continuing education. How do you teach and how do you educate so that the students actually come away with a kind of a commitment? I would never uproot a tree an Israeli planted, which means even going beyond the concern for just human survival.
Right.
How do you build up, a people that will love the land, love the earth, and therefore commit to that kind of a future that right now we can't even imagine.
That's right, right. Well, you do that wonderfully. You and Jim both. We're all grateful to you for doing that. But you're right. I love when you talk about being able to change our desires, our sense of awe away from our phones to maybe just a tree, right, or to a starry night. That would, if people could appreciate that in a tangible way, that opens possibilities that seemingly don't exist right now. Or maybe we're underestimating people in some ways. People are all rendered in some ways powerless. So they simply float along, and maybe beneath the surface, there's something waiting to be awakened, but that's our job. But so far, there's too much sleep. There's just far too much sleep. Moshkan, anything? Dean? Yen, anything?
I'm sorry, I'm a bit from
No, it's fine.
the beginning part, but just even hearing the last 10 minutes, it's shocking. I mean, we hear this in the news all the time, but to catalog the extent of Gaza, the seriousness of the issues, it's just really heartbreaking, yeah, but it also opens up a lot of thinking. I am a historian, so we learned this in history, and this happens, but it's I know I'm just thinking like we are in this moment and this happens, so we can't do anything, and the kind of institutions that we rely on, we count on to do something, are not doing
Right.
the things that we expect them to do. So it, it was striking that this level of hopelessness or helplessness. But at the same time, yeah, I'm really glad we end up with the ending of the lecture with this poem with profound humanity. So it will live on. If we, as we teach our students, there is still hope, and this is something, the seeds that we plant. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you. Thanks for coming. Yeah, Moshkan.
There's a question on the chat.
Sure.
Of sorts from Monica. And I can read it for you. It's the
Sure.
only question, only questions are why was Trump even allowed to run as a seditionist? And when will Biden/Harris administration be called to The Hague for facilitating these crimes? And then maybe we'll have some hope for some new politics.
Right. In the case of Trump, the Supreme Court overruled Colorado in that case, if I believe, not incorrect. So he did run as an insurrectionist. Yeah, I don't know what more to say about that. In terms of Biden, Harris, Blinken, our defense secretary and the like, there's little chance they'll be going to The Hague, to the International Criminal Court, to stand trial. But put it this way, if that court ultimately does issue an indictment against the surviving members of the original proposed indictment, namely Netanyahu and Gallant on the Israeli side, Israel has eliminated the three Hamas personalities who were named in that initial proposed indictment. And if that should ever happen, and it's not clear the ICC has the nerve to move forward with that, and if they were tried and convicted, well, the next logical step would be that the people who facilitated what they did would also be liable for charge. And that would certainly warrant, at the very least, a Biden and a Blinken and those in the defense establishment who have supplied the wherewithal for the killing and the diplomatic cover for politically enabling it and the like. If that happened, then we would know that something has changed. The gears have shifted more toward legality than wanton impunity. I wouldn't wait, but the fact that this has happened needs to be appreciated. And the fact, as I mentioned last time, that people can now talk about this issue without being slammed for anti-Semitism, though that of course still does happen, is also an inch moving forward. Something has changed at great cost, but something has changed, and it's up to us who wish to keep pushing to do so and not to let this opportunity slip by. I hope that helped, Monica.
I'll just say thank you, Alan, for the presentation and putting so much of your time and effort to thinking these issues through and sharing them with everyone. Is your expertise, the work you've done is evident at the same time that your compassion is, and both parts of this talk have been really meaningful to me. It's also a helpful reminder of why people who are environmentalists, it's a reminder to me of the ways in which environmentalism is not just about preserving a particular animal species or an ecosystem, but it's also a humanitarian issue. That access to clean water and medical facilities and food and all electricity, all these things you've talked about. I mean, this is just as crucial a part of being an environmentalist as anything else. And so I appreciate being reminded how these issues in Gaza are forefronting serious environmental issues. So no question, but thank you.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you. I appreciate that. In terms of expertise, I don't really think I have any coming into this, but like you, I can read. And I think if people simply are willing to put in the time and energy, and I know that doesn't exist if you're still working, but if you're retired, you can do that. You can teach old dogs new tricks. So that's all it takes. Just keeping an open mind.
Yeah, I do think there was one lacuna in the presentation. I mean, you could have dealt with what happens with fingernails.
Good point. Good point.
It's unbelievable.
I mean, I think with,
The amount, the comprehensiveness.
let's just say with calcium deficiency, they may not even have fingernails. I mean, I don't know.
Well, I think you're also being humble, Alan, so thank you, because
Thank you.
You do bring expertise as well. I also just wanted to build off of what Dean said, but environmentalists being reminded of humanitarianism. I think this is also a reminder that for humanitarians, they also have to be environmentalists, because there's this important, like, you can't be a good humanitarian without thinking about water and air and space and living. So so I think it goes both ways, and I want to thank you for sharing this, because you went beyond. Very important to also talk about the death and just the crude measures of mortality that I think are reported sometimes in the news. But thank you for going beyond that, because I think that's really important. So just want to thank you, and if you'll read the chat later, you'll see there's lots of people who are also really grateful. So thank you, Alan, for sharing with us and taking so much time to bring this to all of us here and in Zoom.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for being on Zoom and being patient. I appreciate it. Thanks. Onward.